The five people who meant the most to Paul McCartney has spent a lifetime surrounded by extraordinary people. He has shared stages with legends, written songs that became part of history, and experienced a level of fame that very few people could ever imagine. But there is one question that becomes much harder when you have lived that long. Who did you love the most? Not who was the most famous, not who was the most successful, not who had the greatest career. Love doesn't work that way. When someone is gone, you don't measure them by awards or achievements. You remember how they made you feel. You remember the conversations nobody else heard, the jokes that were never recorded, the quiet afternoons, the moments when there wasn't a camera nearby. And looking back across decades of music and memories, five people stand out in McCartney's story. They weren't simply important names from music history. They were people who changed his life, and each one left behind something that fame could never replace. The first is George Martin. For generations of Beatles fans, George Martin is remembered as the producer who helped shape the band's legendary sound. But imagine meeting him before the Beatles had proven anything. Four young musicians walked into Abbey Road with ambition, energy, and a collection of songs. They knew they had something, but they didn't know how far it could go. George Martin did. What made him special wasn't simply his musical knowledge, it was the way he listened. He didn't constantly interrupt. He didn't try to control every idea. He gave the young musicians room to experiment. Sometimes an idea worked. Sometimes it failed completely. The Beatles could spend hours trying something that eventually had to be thrown away, and instead of treating failure as a disaster, Martin could simply encourage them to try another direction. That patience mattered, because young artists don't always need someone to tell them exactly what to do. Sometimes they need someone who says, "Go ahead, try it." George Martin gave them that freedom. He helped them discover possibilities they hadn't even considered, and perhaps that is why McCartney remembered him as much more than a producer. He was a mentor, someone who helped four young musicians become confident enough to trust their own imagination. Years later, the records remained famous. But behind those records was a man sitting quietly in the studio, listening to the next idea. That is the George Martin McCartney remembered. Not simply the producer behind the glass, but the person who believed there was always another possibility. Then came Linda. If George Martin represented music and mentorship, Linda represented something much more personal. Home. By the time Linda became part of McCartney's life, he was already internationally famous, but she didn't seem particularly interested in treating him like a superstar. To her, he was simply Paul, and perhaps that normality was exactly what made their relationship so important. Away from the stage, their lives could be surprisingly simple. Family, children, cooking, the countryside, travel, quiet moments together. The world saw the photographs, the concerts, the famous husband. But the real relationship existed in the ordinary moments between those public appearances. Linda also faced the difficult reality of joining Wings. She wasn't protected from criticism. People questioned her musical ability, people judged her performances, and yet she continued to stand beside Paul on stage, night after night. Imagine facing thousands of people while knowing that some of them have already decided they don't like you. That takes strength. But Linda's greatest influence on Paul may have had nothing to do with performing. She reminded him that music wasn't everything. There would always be another album, another tour, another concert. But family was different. You only get one chance to live those moments. And when Linda became seriously ill, priorities changed completely. The career could wait. The music could wait. Family could not. When Linda died in 1998, She left behind a space that success could never fill. But grief doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it comes quietly. A photograph, a familiar place, a walk through the garden, a song playing unexpectedly. And suddenly, someone who has been gone for years feels close again. That is the strange power of love. People can leave your physical life without leaving your memories, and Linda remained deeply connected to the life Paul had built away from the stage. Then there was John Lennon, perhaps the most obvious name on the list. But John and Paul were much more than two famous musicians. Before the Beatles became a worldwide phenomenon, they were simply two young men who loved music. They met in Liverpool. They discovered that they could create together. And eventually, that partnership became one of the most important songwriting relationships in music history. But the public mostly remembers the songs. What it doesn't always remember are the hours that came before them. The journeys, the waiting, the rehearsals, the arguments, the laughter, the endless attempts to finish another lyric. John could be unpredictable. He could be hilarious one moment and completely serious the next. And that unpredictability became part of what made their friendship so memorable. Of course, they disagreed. Two strong personalities working together for years were never going to agree on everything. But with time, the arguments became less important. What remained were the memories. For years, people have debated who wrote what, who was more important, who contributed more. But when Lennon and McCartney were actually living those years, they weren't thinking about future historians. They were simply trying to create the next song. Then the Beatles ended. Life moved forward. Families changed. Careers changed. The two men no longer shared every day, but the history between them never disappeared. And then came the news that changed everything. John Lennon was murdered in December 1980 suddenly. All those future possibilities were gone. No more unexpected phone calls, no more arguments, no more conversations, no more unfinished songs. And perhaps that is one of the deepest pains of losing someone. You don't only lose the past, you lose the future you thought you still had. McCartney could remember the songs, but behind those songs were two young musicians sitting together, trying to find the right words. That memory could never be replaced. The next person is George Harrison. George had known Paul since the earliest days. He was younger than John and Paul, and in the beginning, he was often the quieter presence in the group. But quiet people can sometimes leave the strongest impressions. George had a sharp, understated sense of humor. He could listen to a conversation for several minutes and then say one sentence that made everyone laugh. And musically, he gradually became impossible to overlook. His guitar playing had its own personality. He didn't seem interested in filling every space with notes. He understood that sometimes less could say more. Over time, the youngest Beatle became an accomplished songwriter in his own right, and the Didik, people closest to him, had watched that transformation happen. That made his relationship with Paul different. They didn't meet after fame. They grew up together. They traveled together. They experienced the unbelievable rise of the Beatles together. And when the band ended, their friendship changed. But it didn't necessarily disappear. Life simply looked different. There were no longer endless tours together, no constant recording sessions, no daily routine. But when old friends meet after years apart, something remarkable can happen. They don't need to prove anything. They don't need an audience. They can simply sit together, talk about music, talk about life, talk about gardening, or say almost nothing. Those quiet moments can become incredibly precious. When George became seriously ill, the situation was painful for everyone who cared about him. There are moments in life when love cannot change the outcome. You can only be there. And after George was gone, his presence continued in unexpected ways. A guitar sound, a chord, a melody, a memory. Sometimes the smallest detail can bring someone back, because when you've known a person for decades, they become part of the way you understand the world. And then there is Ringo Starr, the final name on this list. Some people might argue that he should have appeared earlier, but this isn't really about ranking people. It's about the memories that remain strongest. And Ringo represents something incredibly special. He remembers Paul before the world knew him, before the fame, before the wealth, before the screaming crowds. He remembers the young musician, the friend, the person behind the future legend. The four Beatles spent an enormous amount of time together. The public saw the photographs and heard the records, but they didn't see the endless hours between them. Long drives, flights, backstage, waiting, hotel rooms, recording studios, and all the conversations that disappeared the moment they happened. Those hours created a bond that fame could never manufacture. Ringo also had a gift for making serious situations feel lighter. Sometimes it was a joke. Sometimes it was his expression. Sometimes it was simply perfect timing. That quality was part of what made him such a memorable member of the Beatles, and after the group ended, that friendship remained. They continued to cross paths. They played music together. They celebrated special occasions. They laughed about memories that only the people who were actually there could understand. That's what makes an old friendship different. You don't have to explain your history. The other person already knows it, and perhaps as people grow older, that becomes more valuable than almost anything else. 5 people, 5 different forms of love. George Martin gave McCartney patience and creative belief. Linda gave him family and a sense of home. John Lennon gave him friendship. Yo,